So in this video we're going to look at the useReducer hook. The useReducer hook is an alternative to the useState hook that we've seen previously and is exposed by React in order to update a component's state. The useReducer is always preferable to the useState when the component has to deal with complex logic and functionality before updating the state. As an example, when you work with a multiple subvalue objects with a lot of nested elements within, and you want to update one of these elements of a nested object, or you have a complex array with a lot of children within it, useReducer is a hook that comes really helpful for these cases. It is based on dispatchers to update the state. That means that you will be able to execute some logic before the actual update of the state. React guarantees that the dispatch function that you are going to receive is not going to be changed within any React re-render event that might occur in your application. This means that the function of your reducer and all your logic within the reducer will not get executed on each re-render. The syntax of the useReducer hook is really similar to the one that is used when working with a Redux. So if you are a Redux developer, you will be really familiar with this. Before we get into actual coding, there's a few key concepts that we need to review. The first one is the state. State is the basic of React, and it means basically the persistent value of a React component throughout its lifecycle. The reducer is a plain JavaScript function that is going to apply logic before updating the state. That's where you can customize your own logic and your execution of the code. Then we have a dispatch, which basically refers to the function that it gets returned to you by the useReducer hook. And finally, we get the action. The action is an object that is going to contain the details of the changes that you want to apply to the state. As any React hook, you can assign an initial value, and you can pass that as a second parameter to the useState. In case you want to apply a lazy loading, it is possible to specify a function as a callback to the third parameter of the useReducer hook that is going to execute when the hook initializes. This is especially useful when you want to execute some logic before the actual initialization. That means that your initial state will be variable. Here we have a 5-line snippet where we can see the useReducer hook in action. The first thing we see here is a reducer function. The reducer function is your custom function that is going to execute custom logic when updating the state. The reducer takes a state and an action parameters. The state means the previous state before your current update. So is the previous value of the state of the component. In this case, this reducer is very simple. Basically, it checks for the action type, and in case the action type is a sum, we're going to add +1 to the current state. If the action type do not match a sum, we will just return the state as is. So this is the function that you should specify as a plain JavaScript, and it's called the reducer. Then here we have the actual initialization of the useReducer hook. And as you can see, we pass in two values. The first one is the reducer function that we just mentioned earlier, and then the initial value. For this case, I'm setting the state of the useReducer hook to 0. The returning values of this is the state, which is a reference to the actual state that you can use on your code, and as well the dispatcher. The dispatcher is the method that you will be calling when you want to update this state. As an example, here I've placed a couple of buttons. The first one is going to dispatch an action of type sum that will when the user clicks on this button. This dispatch function is going to call the reducer behind the scenes, and is going to pass in any parameter that you pass as a parameter into the action. Before we jump into the code, let's see how our application looks like and what we are trying to accomplish. So this project that we will be working on today is building a COVID-19 analytic tool that is going to give us data from all the countries and how they are facing the pandemic. Here we have a page that is going to show all the countries and give per each country its active cases, its total death and total recovering. One of the goals for this application is to have a section is going to list our favorite countries. So what we're going to do today is being able to add from the list of all the countries from the world our favorite ones and just. So back in the code, one of the first things we need to do is to be able to switch between sections of the application. We will need to switch between displaying all the countries and just the favorite ones. To do so, we will need to expose a state that is going to control which section you have active. If the application grows, this can also be accomplished by using the React router library. But for this project, it is really simple. We're going to use just a state on the application, on the main application component. So let's go and create our section state, which is going to be a useState hook of type string, by default all, meaning that when user lands on the application, we want them to visualize all the countries on our list, and our section by default will be all. Then this section will need to be passed into a navigation menu, so the user is able to switch between our sections. So this will accept a section, which will be my state, and then it will also be able to activate a section which will receive the callback passing from the useState. So our navigation component will be updating the state of the section. We are getting a few errors here because our navigation component hasn't been updated, so we need to type this into any. This could be an interface as well, but for the sake of this duration of the video, we're going to focus on the hooks. So now that we have our navigation receiving section and the activation, we will actually implement the switching between sections. So to do so, the class name that controls if a section is active or not is this active here. So we'll need to make this a dynamic class. The props that we are going to receive are section and activate. So let's put this as a dynamic class name. If section equals all, then my class name will be active here. If not, it will be an empty class. And the same thing goes for my second list on the menu, which is my favorites. If the section is favorites, then this navigation menu will be active. If not, the class name will be just empty. Okay, this is for the class name, but we also want that when user clicks on these submenus, an action is going to happen, so the section is going to be updated. So to do so, we need to add an onClick method here on both of them. And this onClick is going to trigger a function that is going to call my activate method here, and it's going to pass in the section that we want to activate. So for this case, the first one will be all and the second will be favorite. And if we save this and we haven't done any mistake. So one of the things that we need to implement now is the ability to add countries to our favorites array. If we go back to the UI and we check our application, we see that we need some way to add a country and mark them as favorites. So we need to have some way to add countries to our favorite array. And one thing that we can do that is add here a checkbox element, whether you can check if this country is a part of my favorites or not. To do that, we're going to use one of the features from Nestline framework, which is basically this framework we are using here to stylize the UI. And if we scroll down and we look for checkbox, here's a reference of how to inject a component of checkbox. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to add it as part of my rendering of each of the countries. So what we want to accomplish here is to have a checkbox at the right side where we can specify if we want this country to be our favorite or not. So if we go into context, we need to add a new row here. It can be of 10 width, and here I'm going to pass exactly what the framework is expecting in terms of HTML, and I'm going to replace the text to be favorite. If we now go back, we see that we have this checkbox that we can check, and the idea is that once I will have the list of all the countries in the world, and then I will be able to select which are the favorites I want to be included, and then when I navigate to my favorites, this should be filtered out and just show me the countries that are favorite. So in order to determine whether a country is favorite or not, we will need to modify how a country looks like, and that means updating the interface. So we'll expose a new favorite, which will be of type Boolean in this case. That means we can have a flag that will tell either the country is true, then it's favorite, or if the favorite is false, then the country is not part of my favorite array. And then the checked is going to be based on my current country dot favorite, and that's all that we need to do for now on this component. But if we go back to the application component, there's still one thing that we need to do, is that by default all my countries should be selected as favorite to false. If we go back to application, we see that we still have this to false, but it's because the actual favorite is undefined, because countries right now are being set as the data we receive from the backend. If we look into how backend is giving us the format of the data, we press reload again and we go into the network, we will see that the response per each individual country, there's no favorite. Favorite is the state that is going to be managed by us, by our application. So if we go back here, we will need to, once we receive the countries, we will need to map them and create and apply some modifications. So we're going to map the array of countries that we receive, and that will mean that we will receive a country. I know how to type really. Country, and this country is going to be, it's going to return as a new object which will map, so it's going to copy the same country as we have, but modifying and adding the favorite to false. So all countries by default will be false. So now that we have all our countries with a default value, we are going to actually transition from the useState hook to manage our countries into the actual useReducer hook. The first things we will need to do is to create a reducer function. We will need to create as well an interface for the action passed into the reducer. And finally, we will use a dispatcher in order to call the reducer function. So let's go and create our first reducer function. And this will be our reducer for the countries. The first parameter that any reducer accepts is the current state, in this case countries, which would be an array of my country interface. And the second parameter to it would be the action. An action would determine what logic should the reducer perform. And for this, for now we will get to any, but in a moment we will need to implement an interface. That way we know which type of action this reducer will accept. In this case, we can go with countries action. It will receive a type, and this type will tell which type of action the reducer should perform. That might be addition of new countries. We can also go with favorite, because I'm trying to add a country as a favorite, or I can also unfavorite a country. That way, these are the three types of action that reducer will execute. And this is for the type, but we also need to add a data. Data is the actual values that we are passing into the reducer in order to update the state. So now that we have the interface, we can place it here and we can actually develop our reducer. First thing to check is if we are trying to add countries to our state. So if action type is equal to add, this means that this action is trying to add countries into the state. So we're going to just return our action data. Data would be the countries array that are being passed in as part of the action. If the action is not add, meaning that it can only be favorite or unfavorite. So to do so, we will need to return a new array. In this case, we're going to map all the countries, the existing countries, and per each of them, we will favorite or unfavorite the one that is being requested to. So if we map this, we will need to check if country text is equal to my action data country text. And if it is, we need to return the same country as is. We're not going to modify the country properties except for one, the favorite, because the favorite one should be if my action type is equal to favorite, then I'm going to favorite this country. If my action type is unfavorite, then we will set favorite to false. Okay, so with this in place, we have a reducer and we also have an action. Now what we need to do is to change the actual state, because right now we are using the useState hook instead of useReducer. As we've seen on the beginning of this video, when we use the useReducer, we get back two things. The first one is the actual value of the state, in this case the countries, and the second one is the dispatcher. And the dispatcher is a method or a function that you need to call in order to update the state. Okay, and we're going to use the useReducer hook. The first parameter that this hook accepts is the actual reducer, in this case this method here, and the second one is the initial value. We will start with an empty array. With this in place, we can now go and start using the dispatcher. The first action that we are going to pass into dispatcher would be adding countries. And this addition, it would be once the application loads, we establish an API call to the backend, we get data from the API, and then we update our state. We were previously using the update countries, which was a useState, but now we want to use a dispatcher instead. So once we get our countries and we get the actual value from the API, we're going to update our state using the dispatcher. What we need to pass in are the countries, and to do so, we just need to pass in the same map we were doing before. but this case, oh no, my bad. What we need to pass in is an action. And an action has two, as we've seen on the interface, it has two properties, the type and data. Type in this case will be add, because we are trying to add new countries, the ones that we receive from the API. And the second parameter would be data. And data in this case would be an array. And the array would be the same array we get from the API, with the exception of setting all the favorites to false by default. So with this in place, and if we save this and we go to the application browser, we should see that all the countries load as we had previously, but now the state is managed through the reducer hook rather than the useState hook. Now that we have a reducer in place, what we need to do is actually implement the logic to favorite a country. And to do that, we will need to pass from our application component the dispatcher into the content component. This can be done down here. We will need to pass a new props, and that is the dispatcher. Our country's dispatcher, if we pass it down, it will allow the content component to change the state of the application on each item. So when a country is favorite, it will need to be added into the array as a favorite one. We are seeing an error because we haven't updated the interface. Now we will get a dispatcher of type any, as well as a dispatcher on the props. And this dispatcher, we are going to use it on this checkbox here. So when this checkbox, I'm going to put this on a new line. Once this checkbox is clicked, actually unchanged, we're going to perform a bit of logic here. First of all, we're going to receive the event. And then on this function, we're going to call the dispatch. So we're going to submit a new action into our reducer. And this action is going to have a type and data. Data we already know. We are going to pass in the actual country that is being clicked. So this will be our country here, is the one that we are looping. And for the type, it can be a favorite or unfavorite. And to do so, we are just going to go event, target, and checked, because this is a checkbox. And if it's checked, then we are going to go with favorite. If not, we pass in unfavorite. And right now we are sending a dispatcher action in order to check a country as favorite or uncheck it as unfavorite. But we are not affecting the actual mapping of the countries, because right now when we want to get our countries and show them on the UI, we are just looping through all the array. So in order to filter them, we need to add a new condition here and check for the section. So if my section favorites, so if I'm on the favorite section and not on all, we need to check if this country is favorite or not. So if I'm on the favorite section and my country dot favorite is not favorite, then we're just going to return an empty string, because we don't want to show that country if I'm on the favorite. So if we save this, we still seeing an error, dispatcher, maybe I didn't type, oh, missed a T, and then dispatcher here. Alright, if we save this, no errors, let's go into the code, reload. And then we favorite, for example, World, India, and friends, and we navigate to favorite section, we see that our list of countries has been filtered according to its favorite state. If I can go back and add Germany, and let's say Poland and Argentina, go back, we see that the state update of the countries is done in real time, and you can navigate through sections filtering this. And it's cool because this is exactly what we wanted to accomplish. Let's see, if we unfavorite world from here, it gets removed from the favorite list. But if we go back to all countries, we see world is still here. If we add it again and go back to favorites, we see world appears again. So this has been the purpose of this video, is to transition from a useState hook into a useReducer hook and be able to select our countries as favorites, and the application is looking great. I think for today we've reached the goal, and let's see if we can keep adding new sections to this based on new React hooks that we might look into. All right, see you around.